Hello and welcome to the Extremist Publishing Podcast. I'm Tom Christie, and it's a great pleasure to be here in the beautiful Tayside coastal town of Carnoustie, one of the most historically and culturally interesting places in Angus, as we're about to discover by a discussion with a long-time friend of the podcast, author Mr. Robert Murray, who is the chairperson of the Carnoustie Heritage Group, and he's very kindly agreed to talk a little bit about the history of the group, their activities in the present day, and what they're planning to do in the months ahead. So, Robbie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be with you again and chat about this subject of our local heritage group. It's very nice of you to engage in this chat with me.
So the Carnoustie Heritage Group is a relatively new development, but it's one that has a really exciting and very interesting genesis. Would you like to say a little bit about how things came to start?
It's a strange story, Tom. I first mooted this idea to a friend a few years ago about a heritage group. And the reply I got from the friend, who's still a friend, by the way, was, Robbie, there's nae history in Carnoustie. I had to silently absorb that statement. But it was in my mind and it's always been in my mind, that statement. However, some years ago, around 2018, I was privileged to be attending a Provost meeting in the town when a group from Kirriemuir came to give a talk on Kirriemuir heritage, and it was a very interesting talk indeed. And at the end of the meeting, I said to one of my colleagues, Kirriemuir has a good story to tell on the development of the heritage group. We've nothing like that in Carnoustie. Would you be up for that, David? Well, yes, I think I would. That was the nub of the origins of thinking about pulling together something called a heritage group in the town. Having gone that far, I made contact with the chairperson of the Carnoustie Community Development Trust. I had a good chat with him, and out of that arose the idea that, yes, there is a good place for such a body in the town, and why not call it something like Friends of Carnoustie Heritage Group? And I thought that sounds ideal. And on later thinking about it on that same evening, I realised that we've got important historic connections with the areas surrounding Carnoustie. Carnoustie itself has got great history, but it's more recent than, for example, the village of Barry, which history goes back to the 11th century. We've got the Panbride parish and the house of Dalhousie, which again goes back beyond 11th century. And East Haven, which is a coastal settlement, long-standing and very important sea fishing area. So the title became Carnoustie and District Heritage Group. That was not 2018. The founding meeting I had was with 8 members, people who I judged myself who might be interested in joining me, which they did. Our first meeting was what we call the steering group meeting. I had 8 of my friends gathered together. And sadly, no sooner had we pulled that together when the pandemic hit us. So during that COVID period, we communicated. Strangely enough, we did quite a lot then. The subject of creating our own constitution, for example, was something that would have taken up hours and committee meetings, etc. However, during the quiet non-meeting period, we were able to discuss amongst ourselves our own constitution. We actually designed a logo, and my brother, in fact, was the one who set up some ideas of a logo, and we were able to exchange ideas online. So it wasn't an unproductive period, quite the reverse. So along in April 2023, we had our first formal meeting. We had some public meetings before that, but we had our first formal committee meeting. We had now a chair, i.e. myself, We had a designated secretary, treasurer, a talks convener, and a publicity manager. All of these were key people in the group. We secured 68 members by invitation who were invited to pay £10 per annum, and for that large sum we were able to say we could offer free admission to 5 public meetings in any 12-month period. And so that is exactly how it kicked off. We had no funding, but gradually through very clever treasurer's moves, we were able to make contact with Carnoustie golf links, and they were very kindly able to offer us some funding. Likewise, the charity shops in the town were most supportive, and we found, generally speaking, a great support for the idea of heritage. So that began to give us some feeling of security and moving forward. Over the period of time, we have, in fact, before our formal committee meeting, we'd already conducted a meeting when speakers came along to talk about the Carnoustie hoard. That relates to a Neolithic find in the town. We happen to be located here at a geographical feature called a raised beach. And this raised beach runs for several miles parallel to the current sea shoreline. And the Neolithic finds were discovered at the top of the old raised beach. They turned out to be so amazingly historical interest that none of them are stored in our Carnoustie library, nor indeed in Angus, the county. But 1 or 2 items relate to this find are in Edinburgh, but the really significant ones are, believe it or not, so rare they're in London. And we're seeking some ways of trying to find an exhibition run by ourselves to get some of these Neolithic items brought back into the town for some closer inspection and some interest. However, that was our first talk, and we had over 100 people attend that first meeting. This was followed by a talk on the subject of James Smeaton. He was a man who revolutionised locally the whole idea of the cottage industry, so that he was bringing into one factory the spinning and the weaving of flax, and that developed into jute in times when the flax plant was no longer growing around the area. This whole area geographically was covered in blue blossom, and it must have been a magnificent sight, I have to say. That was a talk on the history of James Smeaton, and he developed an approach to his workforce very similar to the Cadburys, the Rowntrees of this world, where they looked after their employees. And so he designated, designed, built cottages and a central reading institute for his employees. That's the story. We then looked at the formation of the Black Watch. We had a speaker come along and give us an inside story of how the Black Watch was formed in Angus. We've moved on to hearing talks about the development of local railways. And more recently, we were privileged to interview the great-grandson of the founder of the town. That was a man by the name of Thomas Lowson. He was a loomwright, and in the 18th century, he is reputed to be the founder of the town. We had his great-grandson come along and give a talk at the age of 100. He was filmed in his cottage and came along and added some comments on the evening when we showed the film. Since then, last year, we organised a photographic exhibition in the local library. And I'm happy to say that we've got a very close working relationship with a group in the town called Auld Carnoustie, who focus their work mainly on Facebook. They have their own Facebook, and they literally have thousands of old photographs. Basically, the old postcard ideas, which every town and in the country probably, people sent postcards home saying they're having a marvellous holiday, etc., etc. And this has given rise to numerous posts on their Facebook. So we worked in association with Old Carnoustie in putting up our photographic exhibition. They provided us with the old photographs, and we filled 22 frames of photographs, some of which we described as the then and now, which went down very well. So we still have a close working relationship with the Old Carnoustie. In fact, so much so that I've managed to develop a meeting. In addition to our 5 public meetings, I've managed to set up some meetings in the town based in the local Stag pub, the Stag Inn. And it's a strange story, but I'd been trying to find a subject to film, being the railway signalman, because I realised that my father had told me many years ago that someday computerisation will take over and there'll be no longer a railway signalman. And I stressed to try and find who the local railway signalman was. In a strange twist, I went seeking a venue for the Botanist, which is the name I have given to having a reminiscence group of some people who like to chat about the more practical things in their own histories. And lo and behold, I found that the man who manages the Stag Inn is a railway signalman. So luckily, I managed to find a railway signalman to be interviewed and filmed on video. So we have a Botanist on the last Tuesday of each month, and we are getting regularly somewhere around 30 or 40 people at these meetings. They're very informal. I work closely with one of the gentlemen who are involved on Old Carnoustie, and we select in advance topics for discussion, and we show pictures on a large TV screen. Amazingly, it's all new to me, my old age, but it's easy, I believe, to transfer photographs from a mobile phone onto a large TV screen. It's very suitable, easy way to present something. So these are of focal interest, and we discuss items that we see on the screen. So it's very informal. People like to chat. Individuals like, in fact, the very first meeting, I have to say, was February of this year. And as the meetings have progressed, the heartwarming thing about it is 1 or 2 individuals have started bringing along their own artefacts. One gentleman, in fact, turned out to be able to tell the story that Carnoustie had actually manufactured a car, being the Dalhousie car in 1906. 6 cars were produced in the local Anderson Grice foundry in Carnoustie. And this gentleman, amazingly, one of our meetings, was able to say he'd been in England and quite by accident met a gentleman there who had, in fact, 2 Dalhousie cars out of the 6 that have been produced, and by some sheer fluke discovered that this gentleman had one running motor car and another one rather dilapidated but was being used for spare parts. So amazing hand stories like that came to hand. So we are looking forward to developing another photographic exhibition. The Angus Alive group, looking after our libraries, have invited us to go back for a second exhibition sometime. The Botanists are going to continue. I've got ideas of making more films, more videos. We've already mentioned filming the founder's great-grandson. In the can, as they say, is a film of the railway signalman and how his work is conducted. Panbride Church recently closed. It's 11th century church. It recently closed, and I managed to get a film of all the ancient artefacts going back to as far back as Mary Queen of Scots. and even beyond that. So that's filmed. The church's last service has been filmed, and we're in the process of about to interview the minister. I've got plans for other video films to be made. So things are moving along quite swiftly on a positive note, Tom. But that's how it started, just by a little discussion only a few years ago. And it seems to have struck a very productive note, not just the 5 public meetings, but the idea that some people now like to come along and give their own stories at what we call Bothinichts. And I can see that hopefully continuing.
Yeah, because Carnoustie is a remarkable place, actually. I mean, you've alluded to its significant sporting heritage through the golf links, and of course, many internationally acclaimed sports people have been here over the many decades that golf has been a part of life in Carnoustie. But I think also of the actors who have had a genesis here in Carnoustie. I think of Alan Cumming, who, of course, has enjoyed tremendous success on both sides of the Atlantic as an actor. And, of course, one of my own personal favourite performers, Ian McDermott, who is not only a great Shakespearean actor, but also a very accomplished stage director as well. What do you think it is about Carnoustie that has generated so many amazing talents?
I'm sure every town will have, maybe not every town, but it is quite unique, Tom, as you say. Alan Cumming was educated around here in the town, and I think he moved to Aberfeldy in that Lochte area and developed his acting skills. Ian McDermott, I know, born in Carnoustie. Having said that, moved, I think, fairly early in life and moved on, but I think his history, he relates to his acting stage career in Dundee Dramatic Society. So yes, it's, I used to, as a boy when I grew up, ignorantly, used to think to myself, there's no great names of people in Carnoustie. I mean, what does Carnoustie do? I can't think of anyone who's gone off to Carnoustie and done anything noteworthy or at a national level. But how wrong I was in my own ignorance. There you go. The strange thing is that Carnoustie developed by the purchase of some land, and somebody bought a piece of land for £5,000 and started to think about developing the town. Later on, 50 years later or so, sold it for £11,000. But at that point, the feeling was to try and develop a town with designated streets and street planning. But initially, it was a collection of cottages, based usually around a well, obviously, where there was water and gave sustenance to people. And of course, the linen industry would be paramount. Barry, in fact, was a far more flourishing village than Carnoustie. Barry's history with the Barry Mill goes back to the 14th century. So there's a lot of history there. I've mentioned the history of the Panbright Church and East Haven. All of these outlying areas were far more productive than Carnoustie. But then there was a massive surge in Carnoustie, mainly because of the development of people selling fuse. There was a whole arrangement of people buying fuse, long fuse, which still exists to this day, far longer than you would ever imagine. The people in Carnoustie have got gardens 100 yards long, for example. So there was a great sale of fuse. And Kinloch was the man who planned the town and sold off fuse. And gradually there seems to have been quite an interest of people building. I mentioned the Smeaton Jute Works. That became a much more formal arrangement, producing housing for the employees. And I think Carnoustie was a self-sufficient town in the latter part of the 19th century. It was beginning to become a self-sufficient town. It had the jute works, it had a foundry, it had a shoe factory and a canning factory. And there was no such thing as unemployment, even up into my early day as a boy, a young person in the 1950s. Unemployment was simply non-existent. It was a town that was burgeoning, and a large part of that, I think, came from the late 1870s, 1880s, when I think people from Dundee came along with capital and saw the advantages. Prior to that, Carnoustie was seen as the Brighton of the North. It's a bit of a laugh today to think of it as being the Brighton of the North, but that was described as such. And one can imagine that from the difficulties of living and working in the city of Dundee, suddenly to get the fresh air and blue skies on the seashore of Carnoustie must have been a huge relief. In fact, there are villas, semi-detached and detached villas along the shore, or along the front of Carnoustie, with long gardens and cottages built in, specifically to encourage holidaymakers to come along. And over the years, the holiday season developed, and I think the big investments came along when men of means built flats, blocks of flats, substantial housing. At one point in the time, the town ended eastwards at a place called the Loch de Burn, which was the eastern limit of the town. And in 1848, when the railway, the Dundee and Arbroath Railway Company, opened up the railway line, I think that was the most the triggering factor. And so therefore, east of the original eastern boundary became the new town. That was now, in more recent decades, described as the posh end of the town, largely because the capital and the magnificent stone-built mansions and such like were there to be seen. So Carnoustie, in a strange way, is a tune of two halves. And of course, the railway was a huge factor. In fact, I've looked at minutes in the borough council minutes of the day, when the councillors from Carnoustie met with Dundee city councillors to discuss the probability, or hopefully, certainly the possibility, of developing a tram system all the way from Dundee through Moneyfeith to Carnoustie. Likewise, trying to fund a different additional railway platform at the west end of the town. So clearly there was a move to enhance the town, and the economic means by which to do this, I think, were quite evident.
Well, we've spoken a lot about the history and the remarkable cultural heritage of Carnoustie, but I think it's very important, particularly for people who perhaps haven't yet visited, to note that there really is a thriving community here and so much to see and do. Would you like to say a little bit about, the many different things that are going on here in the present day?
Yes, Tom. Carnoustie is a thriving town. As I grew up in the 1950s, as a small town, we had our own Boy Scouts, we had our Boys Brigade, the churches had their own interests and own meetings. I suppose we had the blueprint of what small towns would have in those days. But strangely enough, and it was only brought to me recently with the name immigrant, which made me rather find quite amusing. But what my friend has alluded to was the fact that somewhere along in the 70s, 1970s, early 80s, there was quite a surge of movements from the west coast of Scotland. And that has transpired into further building of quality homes. A lot of professional people came into the town and brought with them new ideas. So I was quite amused at my friend's description of the word immigration. But it's true to say we've now got a flourishing town. If I can give an example, just last year, I went along to an evening to pick up a cheque for our own heritage group from a charity shop. And the meeting was held in the British Legion. The room was packed. And I looked around and I thought, where do all these people come from? But as the evening proceeded, there were called out names for everything from the most obscure and interesting clubs or societies in the town. I'd never heard of some of them before. Some were related to sports, some were related to sporting activities, others to pastimes or elements of social fabric of the town. And I thought to myself then, my friend was right. This immigration process brought in such a comprehensive mixture of interests, which I think can only say is added to the activity in the town. Sadly, along with all of this, there's a move, as we all know, in online shopping, and the shops represented in the town, sadly, are diminishing slightly, which to the observer, it looks sometimes rather sad. But underneath that sad-looking facade, there is a very active town spirit. So that comes from probably the fact that we had these organisations as a basis many, many decades ago. But more recently, these have all developed, and the immigrants, so-called, it wasn't a term I'd ever have thought of using, but that is, in fact, a truism. Yes, you're right, Tom. It is a flourishing town.
And just as important as the past and the present, of course, is the future. So it would be remiss of me not to ask what kind of events you have coming up in the pipeline for the group, and also how people can find out more about it and perhaps join in.
Yes, well, photographic exhibitions is a grand way of giving people an insight into what we're doing. We're going to do more of that. We've been invited to do more of that. I hope I can see the bottlenecks develop. I want to see more participative elements of that. Public speakers that come along on these 5 meetings that we hold each year. I'm hopeful that we can continue to engage people who have done research on certain elements of the town and the district. There's no limit. When you think that every habitation, every element of life, people want to leave stories behind of what they've done, and whether that's the Egyptians or the Picts or whatever, people leave behind them an element of what they're doing. And I'm conscious of that because our own actions today, I'm trying to record, to leave a slice of life as it is today in Carnoustie, and hopefully in our own way go back a little bit to see. Nobody's done a lot of formal work, if anything at all, on looking at the development of Carnoustie as an economic unit. But when we consider we had a foundry, the jute works, we had a shoe factory, a canning factory, a great employment. There was never such a thing as unemployment when I grew up. People could move at will. And one of the strange things, the Anders and Grice foundry was a magnificent basis for future marine engineers. It had a great name for people I knew in my school days who went off to be what I thought at the time seemed like an ordinary job to do in engineering, and I thought some of it, I was never attracted to it myself. It sounded to me as if it might not hold a lot of interest. But amazingly, it turns out that it was a spawning ground for marine engineers and marine seagoing people around who made careers out of it all. So it's got that sort of basis to develop young people.
Well, Robbie, thank you so much for having joined us today and having explained so much about what's going on with the Friends of Carnoustie Heritage Group. I do hope that if you have an interest that you will seek them out on social media and find out more about what the group's activities are in the coming months ahead. And also, if you haven't been to Carnoustie, that you will consider coming along to visit the town for yourself, because it really is the most remarkable culturally and historically significant place here in the county of Angus that I really think you will certainly enjoy a visit and find much here to interest you. So thanks again, Robbie, for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to have that chat with you. I should have just added that we're trying to create some heritage walks, which can be guided walks. I'm seeking to get more publicity into hotels and Airbnbs, boarding houses, etc., to encourage people with walks with heritage inserts and try to create that. There's nothing hugely been done on that over the years. So that's one way of trying to encourage the visitor to the town to learn something about our history.
So thanks again, Robbie, for sharing your time and your thoughts. And thank you everyone at home for listening. I hope that you'll join in again soon.
Thank you, Tom.